All right, welcome to video 3 of 4. We're talking about the Yakama tribe. And now we're going to look at the aftermath of those treaty negotiations that we were talking about in the last couple of videos. All right, so the treaties happen, the Yakama get put onto their reservation, right? And there's a number of things that are happening, some right around the same time, others across time in the aftermath of that. Okay, so got a list of 5 things here, and we're going to talk about each one in turn. We're going to start with the Donation Act, which these are, anytime it says act, by the way, just know that those are federal government actions. They're not state government actions. Okay, so the Donation Act, which happened in 1850, Congress provided that applicants with up to 320 acres of free land if they moved to Washington or Oregon between 1850 and 1853. So it's a very narrow window of time and a very narrow amount of space comparatively. Right? But they had to live on the land and they had to farm it for 4 consecutive years. So in other words, you move to the land, you clear the trees off, you build yourself your house, you plant your crops, and you live there for 4 years, and then you can get title to it. Okay, so you don't get title right away, but that's the Donation Act in 1850. Arguably the much more significant one, though, is the Homestead Act, which happens in 1862. Okay, and this one is passed by Congress and signed by Abraham Lincoln. And what it does is it provides any one citizen with up to 160 acres of land for free if they live on the land and farm it. Okay, so you've got to clear trees, you've got to put at least part of the land under cultivation. Okay, but you're getting it for free. Okay, and that's throughout the West. So that one's not specific to Washington and Oregon. It doesn't have a time limit on it. Matter of fact, it goes for quite a long while. I think it goes into almost, or I might almost go into the 20th century when we're talking about Alaska, right? But it's a much more influential, much more widely known act, and it encourages a lot more people, especially when the Civil War ends in 1865, to move west. Okay, but you have to be a citizen. That's the other key piece with the Homestead Act, is you have to be a citizen to claim that land, which means because Native Americans weren't citizens until 1924, they're not citizens of the United States, they're not eligible to claim land under the Homestead Act. Okay. Prior to 1924, they're considered to be citizens of their tribes, which are considered to be completely independent nations. So they did not have the same rights and responsibilities of folks who were American citizens. So the next one, which actually really spans a lot of time, so technically it starts a little before the Homestead Act, but goes much longer, is our residential schools, right? And residential schools is kind of a sanitized name for it. Probably, arguably, the much better one is an assimilation school. Okay, so these are schools, much like you or I might attend, typically, but not always, boarding schools. Okay, and the specific reason why they exist is to teach Native American children civilized habits, and civilized habits in quotation marks, much like it was, that word civilized was in the last video. Okay, and the idea is to borrow a really incredibly famous quote from one of the earliest headmasters of one of these schools. You want to kill the Indian to save the man. So this is not a literal kill somebody. Okay, that's not the goal, though that is sometimes the outcome. It's not the goal. The goal is to kill off Indian culture in order to civilize Indian people and turn them more into white people. So when we talk about assimilation, that's what that means, to strip something away from its original culture and to replace that culture with a different one. And when people do that voluntarily, it's one thing, but this is not voluntarily. Okay. So you see immigrants, for example, assimilation will happen across 2 or 3 generations. As people live here, their families will gradually lose their home culture. That's not what this is. This is very much, we're going to take children. Sometimes they're kidnapped. Sometimes they're stripped from their parents' arms. Okay. And they are forced to go to these schools. For the real little kids, they're a little bit closer to what you and I might think of elementary school, but as soon as the kids start being around your age, a little bit younger, they start turning into more like training schools for skills. So they start teaching them things like how to farm, how to be a blacksmith or a carpenter, right? Trade schools, that's the word I was looking for. For the girls, they're teaching them how to clean house like a white lady might, how to sew in the ways white women sew, right? And the whole time they are requiring that the kids not speak their own language, that they not eat their traditional foods, that they not maintain traditional ways of life, so they don't get to keep their traditional clothes, they have to cut their hair, they have to adopt a new name. They're literally, what the goal is we're stripping away that indigenous culture, right? And in so doing, okay, what we're doing is, in theory at least, teaching them how to be white people, okay? But again, this is not something that's voluntary. These are not kids that are choosing it. It's not happening in the way it might for you or I if we move to a new place, right? Where it happens gradually across time. These are kids in situations where they're being beaten, where they're being physically and emotionally abused. Pretty much 100% of kids, if not all 100%. Some are being sexually abused, right? These are very, very harsh conditions. And what ends up happening, it creates problems at the time, because not only do you have these kids who, when they do return home, and they were either required to stay at the schools or strongly discouraged from going home during school breaks, right? But ultimately, when they do return home, they don't speak the language, they don't know how to do things in traditional ways, right? Their native culture has been stripped from them. So they're alienated and estranged from that culture, but they also don't look like white people. So it's not like they're getting just adapted and adopted into white culture either. And they end up really becoming strangers in a strange land, as it were. Okay. And that creates all kinds of intergenerational trauma that you see. And it happened at the time and was a huge, huge problem at the time with these schools. It continues to be a problem, right? It is within living memory that the folks who were forced to go to these schools were still alive, as in people's parents and grandparents of folks alive today, right? Were forced to attend these schools. So it causes that intergenerational trauma that we're still seeing. And we're only just now communities are really starting to come out of in a lot of ways. Okay, so that's the assimilation schools, the boarding schools, right? Next one is the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act provides for the division of reservation lands into individual allotments. Remember, with the last video, individual allotments means that each person is getting a set amount of land. And depending on on the tribal group and depending on that specific person's situation. That could be anywhere from 40 acres to 160 acres. And that land goes from being communal, which means nobody can buy it or sell it without permission from everybody, to being individual, which means that the individuals can then buy or sell for whatever they want. Okay. And what ends up happening is there's a loss of somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 million acres of reservation land. This is 1887, so if you think back to that first video and that map that we were watching change across time, it happens right around the time that map ends. And so if you see the big difference between when it cuts in 1883 and then it shows right at the very end the 2010 map, those changes are almost entirely due to the Dawes Act. Okay, and the idea is we're going to completely get rid of the reservations. That's the plan and the hope. Doesn't work out that way. The Dawes Act is in place for about 50 years, a little bit less, and it's modified a few times, but it's ultimately terminated before all of the reservations are gotten rid of. Okay, so it does get rid of some reservations, but not all of them. Okay, and it results not only, so I mentioned that loss of land, right, that 90 million acres across the U.S. that's lost, but it also means that folks are losing access to traditional fishing areas, traditional hunting areas, gathering areas, and things like that. And that's going to become an increasing problem, right? So the Dawes Act happens in 1887. It gets repealed in 1934. And then the next one on our list there is the Bolt decision. So between 1934 and about 1970, what you really see is a slide as folks are, we've got those folks who've been through the boarding schools, they've had their cultures ripped away from them, they've been beaten, they've been abused, they have been really treated pretty horribly and beaten down, and there's a lot of real denigration of Native American culture that happens in that period. And then in about the 1950s and 60s, what you start to see in the country in general are a bunch of civil rights movements with different groups. You're probably familiar with the African American civil rights movement, right? That's Martin Luther King and that kind of stuff. You might even be a little familiar with third wave feminism, which is around that time, right? But pretty much every minority group had a social movement, and that includes Native Americans. As part of that, ultimately, what you see are tribal groups starting to work to reestablish their rights to their lands and their traditional ways of living. So they're beginning to reclaim that culture. And part of that, a group of tribes in Washington goes to federal court and they sue the state of Washington because they want the treaties enforced. That's those Stevens treaties that we were talking about, that by 1970 are over 100 years old, right? And specifically what they want enforced, or they want access to traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds. And ultimately what the decision says is that they should have access to half of the salmon catch, was specifically about salmon, right, and about fishing rights. So they should have access to half. They should be entitled to half of it, and that the fishery lands should be managed in common with the state of Washington, which means the state of Washington has to go from treating them as kind of like a little brother that they're not going to like or respect to treating them as equals. And that's the situation today, okay, is that the tribes in the state work together to manage those fisheries for everybody's access. So about half the catch goes to commercial fishing and sports fishing, and half the catch goes to Native Americans, which then they decide how they're going to use those fish and what they're going to use them for. Okay. The outcome of the Bolt decision. So I mentioned the assimilation schools really kind of choking off Native American culture, right? And the Dawes Act working to get rid of reservations. But the Bolt decision is where you really start to see the pickup and the improvement, the reclamation, reclaiming of native cultures and pride in being. Okay, and the outcomes of some of that, then you start to see things like native language programs being offered. So for example, I live in Des Moines, which is right near Federal Way in Auburn, and in Auburn is the Muckleshoot tribe, and at the Muckleshoot Tribal School, which is not in the city of Auburn, but just beyond it on the reservation, they offer Muckleshoot language classes, right? At the Makah, which is they're out on the Olympic Peninsula, right out on the tip out by the Pacific Ocean, right? They've started to get back to doing some traditional whaling. They're not killing tons of whales, but 1 or 2 a year, right? And getting back into some of those traditional practices and rebuilding those traditional muscles. Up in Nooksack, up north of Bellingham, right, northwest of Bellingham, there's the Northwest Indian College, and they teach, not only do they teach things like language classes and traditional crafts, but also more academic subjects, right? But with that emphasis on pride of place, pride of culture. So those are some of the key decisions, right, that impact tribes and tribal sovereignty. And these are ones, by the way, that are going to be fairly universal. So it's not just the Yakama tribe, which is why I mentioned you might want to take some notes. So let's talk a little more now. Let's zero in a little more on the Yakama tribe, right, and what's going on. So 1855, we've got that treaty signed, right? And right away, as soon as the treaty is signed, Isaac Stevens opens up land to settlers. The Confederated tribes, they don't have a chance to really get to know or get the word out to get people moved on to the reservation. There's no lag time there. He immediately opens up land to settlers. Well, that creates some conflict then, as you've got folks who, because remember, it's a big, big space. You got white folks claiming land that is traditionally used for hunting, for fishing, for gathering, activities like that by various folks in the Yakama Confederated tribes, right? That big long list of tribes from the treaty. And so conflict happens, right? There's some fighting. That's the Yakama Wars. And those go on for a few years, actually, right? as folks are being forcibly moved onto the reservation and words getting around and things like that. So about 1858, that's when those wars conclude. Okay. But as with so many treaties and as with so many wars between Native American tribes and the U.S. government, okay, the tribe gets punished by having their land, even more land taken. So they're literally lose about half of their originally promised reservation land. Okay. But now they're forced onto the reservation by about 1859. Around 1860, remember the government said they'd set up schools and start educating people. So they do set up a school on the Yakama reservation. Right? And depending on where kids are at on that reservation, even the much smaller one, right? It's still a boarding school for at least some of those kids, or at least they're boarding nearby. And again, remember the idea is to strip the culture away from people. So that happens about 1860. About a generation and a half later, 1887, the Dawes Act happens, and at least some of, there's still Yakama reservation, but at least some of the land is split up and sold off. Okay, and we're going to watch video about that in just a minute here. So the land is split up and sold off to white settlers. Okay, and that causes its own batch of problems. And then, so that happens 1887. About 1933, we see what was called the Yakama tribe, right, as if it were a single tribe, when you and I know it's actually a group of about a dozen or so tribes, maybe more, or kinship groups, right, tribal groups, into what becomes called the Yakama tribe, or sorry, Confederated Tribes of the Yakama Nation. That's what I'm looking for, right? And that's the title they go by even today. And then what we see happening in 1994, so remember 1970 is the Bolt decision, and we start to see that reclamation of pride. People are becoming much more proud of who they are. They are really seeking out and beginning to learn again those native ways, right? We see the Yakama Nation go through and correct the spelling of their name, which had been misspelled for a lot of years. So instead of Yakama with an I, which is how the city of Yakama is spelled, right? They correct it to Yakama with an A, which is how it had more traditionally been spelled. And you know that that's how it was traditionally spelled because that's how it's spelled in the treaty, right, in the 1850s. So that's kind of our timeline, just help you place things in your head in terms of the time. All right, so I'm going to have you pause your video, jot some notes, okay, because I'm going to pull one of these questions and it's going to go up in Canvas and you're going to answer it just so that I know you got stuff, right? Here's your two questions that I want you to jot some notes about. What do you think was the greatest impact of these decisions on the on the ways of life of the tribes in Washington? Okay, so what do you think was the greatest impact of these decisions on the ways of life of the tribes in Washington? And then, how do you think that these decisions impacted their identities, cultures, and traditions? So go ahead, pause your video, jot yourself some notes about it. Okay, and then when you're done, go ahead and start the video again. All right, so this is the last slide for this section of the video. And it's an interview with a Yakama elder, a woman by the name of Marlene Silma. Okay. And I'm going to ask you to take notes, think about two questions. And we're going to pull out, again, one of these two questions. You're going to answer it in Canvas. Okay. So what is Marlene Silma's perspective on the treaties and their impact on her people? Okay, so now we're drilling down into how at least one Yakama person thinks about these treaties, right? Their experience is probably somewhat generalizable, but just recognize it as a single person, and like with any person in a group, they don't represent the whole group, but it's probably reasonably generalizable. And then question 2, right? What does Marlene Silma think of the murals? And so the murals specifically are some ones in Toppenish. All right, here we go.
I am Marlene Spencer Simla. I don't know where the name came from, but my great-great-great-grandfather was born probably in the 1800s, and his name was Spencer. His son also was Chief Spencer, and they were chiefs of their own little villages. And they told them when it was time to go out and gather the roots, when it was time to go hunting, when it was fishing, when they were done fishing. And they didn't go out and catch like 20 fish and sell them. They traded with their neighbors, or they shared. It's nothing like today, commercial. They only used what they needed. The Yakamas aren't a tribe. The Yakama, now they are, but Yakama starts from way up above Wenatchee, up in the mountains, and comes all the way down to below the Columbia River, and it's comprised of all these different villages, all different kinds of Native American names, and usually means like that's a hill, that's a river, that's a stream, that's that's where the names, how they named them. They couldn't pronounce all those names, Klickitat, Chinook, Cowlitz, so they just said, you're Yakama, because of the Yakama River. The United States was only first 14 states back east, and then as the settlers kept coming this way to the Mississippi River, then it became 30 states, and then down toward California, they were fighting the Mexican War. They're all kinds of war. The Spanish-American War. The Indians were fighting them to get out. They just kept coming. The settlers, of course, had the power with the guns. There were just way too many settlers. The treaty said, you sign this. The army told the chiefs, you come here and sign this paper. We're going to educate your kids. They're going to learn, it's like we were pagans, we were savages. And they said, no, you have to learn society. You have to learn to be civil. If they didn't, they were hung. They strung them up to a tree and hung them. The white man hanged people. Indian kids were removed from their families. No more grandma, no more mom, dad, uncle. They were put with military, where they had to march every day, march in a straight line, and respect the flag. About 1872 or 1874, somewhere in there, this guy named Dawes, D-A-W-E-S, did this act with Congress. He said, all of these Indians wandering around the reservation, we're going to give them land. We're going to teach them to farm that land. They're going to raise their own cucumbers and their own tomato and their own corn. They're going to start being civilized. Stop this running around and picking berries and picking roots and So they called it the Allotment Act. We're giving you 80 acres, you 80 acres, your wife 80 acres, your 4 kids 80 acres each. You're all going to use this land and learn to live on it and stop this wandering around. You're going to school. We're going to build you a hospital for when your people get sick. We're going to build you a big school and educate your kids. We're going to do this for you, whether they liked it or not. And so that's how they got the land, the Allotment Act. The Indians found out, some of them liked to drink. They could sell their allotment for 2 bottles of beer and $100. And they were selling their allotment and moving back in with mom. That was their custom. And they said, at first it was happening so fast, they said, wait a minute, what are you guys doing? You don't be selling your land. So the settlers loved it. They came flying in. They said, here, I'll give you a case of beer. And here's $50, and I'll take your land. But you can come back and visit me. And they did, yeah. And so the white man said, we're going to build a town here and name it after me, Smith. This is Smithville. And they did. They got the allotment, they cut it up into 205 acres each, and let the white man build. Murals are history. I'm only speaking for myself, not for the tribe. I didn't care for the murals when they first began. I said I'd help them paint, and they looked at me like, who are you? They didn't know who I was. It was white people painting Indians. There's one mural where it shows them all drumming. They're playing a stick game and drumming. All the Indians look alike. We don't all look alike. We're each unique. They're painting a lot of white people, how they did good for us. They're not painting the Indians' perspective. People need to understand each other in order to respect each other. And they can come here. They bring schools here. There are groups that come here. And they see how we used to live.
Yeah.
And they respect. You respect this culture by understanding it.
All right, so as I was saying, right, we're going to actually wrap up this video number 3 here. But as I was saying, so these are the 2 questions. What's Marlene Silma's perspective on the treaties and their impact on our people? Okay. And remember that while her opinions might be specific to her, the thought behind those opinions is probably pretty generalizable. Okay, so it means shared by a lot of people. And then what does she think of the murals that she's talking about in Toppenish right there at the end of the video? Okay. So take some time, wrap up your notes for those questions, and then we'll wrap things up with one more video that I promise will be much, much shorter than this, and get you on your way. Don't forget, answer those questions in Canvas. All right, so we'll continue with part 4 of our video series. Go ahead and go.